The teacup trembled in Shen Mingyue's fingers, a pale circle of steam rising like a question. For a heartbeat the room was only the soft clink of porcelain and the rustle of silk. Then the tea slumped from her hand, and the cup toppled, silver pins striking the lacquered tray, and darkening like a bruise. They all leaned forward at one size, voices, the household in a single collective intake of breath. Someone whispered the word that had already been placed on a rope around her neck. Poison. Mingyue tasted past lives on her tongue, the cold of a courtyard floor against her cheek, the distant laughter she could no longer answer, the final stain of red. She had tried, once, to believe it was the end. Once she had let others decide whether she lived or died. Not this time. I will not disappear again. She rose before anyone could move, slow, unyielding, letting the faintness she had performed a fraction of a second earlier dissolve into steady breath. Faces swam with triumph, concern, accusation. Shen Mingyue's smile was a blade sheathed only by silk. It gleamed with something very like hunger. The cup turned black, someone said. Silver told us so. It is the sign. The words were the smallest of traps. A single phrase that, once set down, could be gathered up and used to strangle a woman's reputation. Bring a bowl. Qiangao called gently. The voice of a sister, stepping into the role of savior. Let the household physician test it again, no need to alarm the guests. Mingyue bowed her head, while a servant went to fetch a basin. Beneath the calm, she catalogued the scene the way a surgeon notes a wound. Faces, roots, timing. The chancellor's hall smelled of incense and fear. Her parents sat like two statues, warmed at the edges by duty, but cooled by the court's rumor. Brothers shifted in their seats, alliances rearranging themselves in micro-gestures. There were men who wanted to keep peace, men who wanted to seize advantage. She could see, too, the small technicalities of the attempt, how the toxin had been administered, so that a feint would look involuntary. The precise moment when an overdosed calming draught would blur senses without leaving immediate marks. It was not artistry. It was intent. Qiangzhao's hand hovered near the tea tray. As the physician knelt, Mingyue caught the motion and let a thread of silk slip from her sleeve, so elegantly accidental that no one noticed. The silk brushed the tray, finished the illusion of clumsiness, and hid the truth for the moment. If her sister had placed anything, it had been done with the surety of someone who believed she would never be believed in return. She had to hold her face like carved jade. Expression would be a verdict here. To falter would be to invite the gallows. A family law. A servant returned with water and the silver pin, now a blotched coin of blackness. The physician muttered, running a practiced hand over lips and wrist, the motions of someone who had seen more faintings than he could count. He gave no answer, the way a pledged juror might not. Outside the hall, the city moved with ordinary cruelty. Market calls, the clop of a cart's wheel, a dog snapping at a scrap. Inside, the household was a map of plotted roads and ambushes. Someone stood to benefit if Mingyue were removed from the equation. They'd called it charity. They called it protection. Qiangzhao called it necessary. Mingyue's memory handed her a small, cold thing. The face of a man who had once stopped to help a bleeding traveler by the bridge. A scholar, perhaps. Hand clean. Eyes quick. Song Lin, she thought. The name like a pebble in a pocket. She had seen him only twice in memory. Once as a shadow in a previous life's crowded doorway. Once as a ghost in a dream. He had been someone who smiled at wrong things and loved poetry even as the world burned around him. They would later say Song Lin was dead. For now, the rumor was thin and bright, as a matchstick, smoke enough to ignite suspicion without yet forming a flame. Mingyue kept her plans like a folded letter against her ribs. Her father spoke in measured tones, a prime minister elder who feared scandal more than he feared injustice. We will not act on rumor, he insisted. though the tremor in his voice betrayed the pull of public opinion. The Chancellor's household argued on a scale that was never only about one woman. Alliances were not always planned. Sometimes they were a habit of small kindnesses and long memories. Her elder brother, cool, deliberate, gave only one look, an unspoken promise to observe, rather than commit. Another brother, younger and quick to flame, shifted closer to Qianzhao's camp, liking the idea of inheritance rearranged. Mingyue kept her expression neutral, but her eyes, those precise blue-black orbs, catalogued allegiance and readiness. A sister's smile could be a weapon. A brother's silence could be a shield. She would need both to win the invisible war being waged. As the household physicians murmured, and the servants moved like waves around the hall, Mingyue let the smallest of actions be her proof. She called for a cloth, not to wipe her lips, as a weak woman might, but to produce a scrap of linen used to wrap medicinal herbs that smelled faintly of mandrake. The cloth should have been the sort used only in the inner east wing. Few servants would know of its scent. She laid it subtly beside the basin, where the blackened silver pin would rest, and watched the flinch in the physician's eyes when he smelled it. Mandrake did not turn silver black by itself. Some toxins reacted with silver, the way iron corrodes an old and reliable test for certain alkaloids. But mandrake was the sort of remedy that an apothecary used to call out poison with equal parts science and superstition. To insist on mandrake was to force a demonstration in the light of common practice. Qianzhao's smile narrowed. Had she not expected this? Had she not planned for something as quaint as a mandrake test? Or had she counted on the household's physicians to be too eager to reach a verdict that hampered Mingyue's voice? Mingyue's heartbeat, once hard and bright. Her chest was a drum, announcing intention. "It is best we do this carefully," Mingyue said, making her voice level and small enough that a conspirator might mistake it for humility. "If there is a poison, we must not ruin the evidence. If there is not, then we have peace." Qianzhao's reply was oil. "We do not need to draw curtains," she said. "Let the household see the test. Let them see we are careful. You would not ask for secrecy if you had nothing to fear." It was a trap that she set to look like kindness. The household would watch. If the test suggested poisoning, it would be taken as fact. If it did not, Qianzhao had already planted the narrative. Suspicious behavior, a feigning that matched the story, all the small threads that could be braided into guilt. Mingyue bowed her head and agreed. She would let them braid for now while she quietly unpicked the knots. A footfall sounded outside the hall, off-key in its urgency. Qin Lang, the Chancellor's trusted guard, arrived, flushed and pale. He had been Mingyue's first small ally in the household, a man who had once slipped her a bowl of extra porridge when she had been a child. He moved like someone who had seen a shadow of a thing and kept that knowledge to himself. "Master Songlin," he said in a voice that had not yet hardened into the cadence of court. "There was talk someone found a scholar. He was hurt on the road. I thought it could matter." "Dead?" Qianzhao's eyes gleamed. She had already written an invisible line under the word with her tongue. "No." Qinlang hesitated. "They said he might be left for dead, but not." "Master." A small, measuring silence followed. If Song Lin were merely missing, there remained a thread of possibility. If he were truly gone, the accusations against Mingyue could be made absolute, her name smeared in a way no later demonstration could fully clear. Mingyue felt the old life's edge sharpen. A life where she had assumed death's finality, where she had allowed herself to be small, until a rumor flattened her out of existence. Memory might be a curse, but it had also made her cautious. She would plant seeds now that could be harvested later. A hidden thread could undo a tapestry of lies. The physician set the blackened silver into warm water. The reaction bloomed slowly, like a bruise, taking color. Mingyue watched without looking, letting the fee for attention be paid. not in speech but in watchfulness. If the silver blackened from the tea alone, then the demonstrable proof would be inside the teacup someone had indeed placed or contaminated it. See. Qiangao breathed. Face composed. Evident. Her father's fist tightened on the arm of his chair. If the physician says so. The rest of the sentence trailed into the floorboards. Unfinished. Mingyue stepped forward then. The motion quiet, but full of purpose. Before we reach any conclusion, she said softly, I ask only two things. 1. Let the tea tray and its remains be preserved. 2. Let no one leave the household until the physician has completed his inspection. If there is truth, we will follow it. If not, she allowed the last clause to hang so that it could be finished by others however they chose. Her words, built of patience, and the thread of patience, bought her a thin hour. Her father agreed. Cautious as a man before an old storm, the household would be observed. The servants would stay in place. Qianjia's smile did not falter entirely. But a crease moved near her mouth. That was not charm. Outside the hall, the city began to murmur like a meadow where a storm might pass. Rumor would walk faster than thought now. The world loved a scandal, the way a dog loves a bone. Later, wrapped in the privacy of her own chamber, Mingyue pulled a small box from under her bed. Inside lay a coinage mirror, and 3 thin slips of paper. All the size of prayers. On one slip, a name had been written in a hurried, almost childlike hand. Song Lin. On another, an addressing alley near the east gate, where beggars sometimes traded news for bread. On the third, a single word that boiled into a plan. Find. Her fingers trembled, seed of both terror and a dawning anger. To be plotted against was one thing, to be manipulated into death was another. She had returned with memory, with the ache of having been given another draft on life. Memory was not only grief, it was strategy. I remember how they looked at me the last time. The way their faces found it easier to believe a lie than to look at their hands. She stroked the slip of paper, and folded it into the hollow of her palm. Her thoughts moved, like chess pieces. Where to find evidence? Who could be trusted to hold a secret? Whether Pei Wenjing, the Duke's son who had once threatened her with his own dark rumors, be persuaded to stand for truth, rather than for advantage. Pei Wenjing had been a storm in the season of her life, when storms were the kind of weather that left cities rearranged. Handsome, in a way that did not excuse cruelty. He had once been at the center of a scandal that Qianjiao had used to climb a rung higher. He and Mingyue had crossed paths again 2 nights ago by the garden wall. By accident, and by design. That night, he had saved her from a pair of young men sent no doubt by someone wanting to rough her on. Easy threat to test a woman's resolve. He had argued with them, stepped between them, and his voice had been a vow. The gesture had not been for love then. It had been a decision. He had watched, and something in the way he watched now could be a future defense if she could earn it. Earning it would mean giving him proof he could hold publicly. It would mean showing him that Qianjiao's reach extended beyond petty slights and into murder. She thought of the blackened silver, and the mandrake's scent, and the silk thread she had allowed to fall. Each small action had not been chance. Each small action had been placed where it might later be plucked as proof. Memory had taught her how to seed things without showing the gardener's hands. The household physicians worked in the hall. The servants whispered and watched their masters as if masters were animals that might be toppled. Qianjiao retreated to her chambers to prepare for the next move. Rumor. Witness. Accusation. 3 knives. Used in a precise order. Mingyue found Qin Lang under the eaves, where the moon painted the courtyard like a pale coin. He kept his voice low, as though the walls had ears, and the gates were jealous. I spoke of the scholar because I thought it might matter, he said, looking at her with an honesty that made her stomach unclench. I saw him, miss. He was not exactly dead. There was blood, but there was also a carriage that took him. An old shepherd boy said. A stranger helped him. The boy swore with his life that someone carried him away from the road. Mingyu's pulse quickened. A crowded room would make Qianzhao's accusations bloom into reputations and tax the household's patience. But a living witness, Song Lin himself, would be the key that could open the door clean. Who carried him? Mingyue asked. Qinling shook his head. A man with rough hands and a green cloak. No one asked his name, no one knew if he was of the city. Mingyue could feel the contour of a plan forming. A living witness was valuable in the way heat is valuable to a frozen field. It thawed the surface of falsehood. Song Lin could, with a single tremor of testimony, reorient a room's belief. She would need a way to produce him at the right time, to prevent Qianzhao from moving the chess pieces first. She could not kidnap him from a stranger's hands. That would be as messy as the violence she refused to become. Instead, she would coax his name into the world. A poem, perhaps, left in a place where a scholar might find it. A rumor of a patron who admired clever words. She could plant a breadcrumb trail of kindness that a poet, proud and hungry, would not be able to ignore. But even as hope flickered, the household's storm shifted toward another direction. A messenger arrived from the Duke's mansion. Pei Wenjing was unwell. He had caught wind of the scandal and had returned. The letter itself was brief and formal, with the Duke's crest stamped in the corner. It brought with it a ripple that suggested support, or at least interest. Mingyue felt the pull of alliances tighten around her like both rope and rescue net. Pei Wenjing's name being invoked in the hall could be both a blessing and a provocation. For Qianzhao, his involvement might have been a risk she had already calculated. For Mingyue, it might mean a partnership she had not yet learned to trust. Keep your friends close, she thought. The old aphorism shaped by a life that now held knowledge of how quickly a friend could become an enemy. She slept but briefly, planning with the exactness of someone who prepares for surgery. A list of people who might be loyal, a list of people who might be bribed, and a list of things that must be preserved. The tray, the cup, the silver, the mandrake-stained cloth, Qinling's testimony of the carriage, and a scrap of handwriting that might be traced to a hand that wrote letters for the household. The next morning, the Chancellor arranged a small family court. It would not be final. It would be a hearing, a place where accusations could be measured, and a household could decide whether a scandal would ruin them. Qianzhao would speak. Of course, she would not be so careless as to leave such a stage to coincidence. The Prime Minister would preside with the gravitas of a man who preferred the appearance of order to the disorder of justice. Mingyue dressed in the simple robe of a woman who refused to adorn herself when a fight was at hand. Her hair was pinned with the silver pin that only had meaning to the household, and to those who could read the language of family intrigue. She placed a second pin plain, iron under her gown. Nothing for show, everything for the small tests she might need later. At the hall's threshold, the servants parted with the sort of silence given to an empress rather than a girl accused. It was, deliberately, a contradictory kindness. They performed reverence because they feared the spoils that might come from appearing loyal to the victor. Mingyue understood their calculations. She would have to show them that the victor could be just. When she entered, Qianzhao stood like a peony in a cold garden, beautiful and sharp, her eyes holding the same smile that had become a weapon. You will speak, Qianzhao said, as if offering. You will tell us what happened. Mingyue bowed her head. I will answer, honestly. There were people in the hall whose faces she knew well. There were others who watched as if this were a theater and not a family. In the front, by the Prime Minister, sat a messenger from the Empress's courts, white-haired eyes that weighed things by the crown. A remote authority was never far from a household's decisions. Scandal left ripples that sometimes reached thrones. Qianzhao rose first. She spoke with the performance of righteousness. Miss Mingyue, she said, voice steady, has endangered this household. She has been careless. She has accepted the company of questionable men. The evidence is before you. She swept an arm toward the physician and the tray as if a stagehand had placed the proof exactly where she wanted it. The silver blackened. She fainted, for no prudent reason. A scholar who once was seen walking with her Song Lin has been found wounded and abandoned. The pattern is plain. Murmurs slid through the hall like a low wind. Qian Zhao's accusations were surgical in their simplicity. Tie a surprising feint to suspicious company. Lean the household's physicians toward presumptive conclusion, and let social fear do the rest. Mingyue felt the world tilt. Her mouth opened to speak, to explain, to redirect attention to the flaws in the evidence. But there is a kind of argument that must be staged, not stated. A kind that needs to be shaped so others can hold it without dropping it. She began with the medicine. Mandrake will respond to certain alkaloids, she said, letting her voice carry clear and small. But there are ways to make such a reaction occur without the poison being in the tea. Silver can be darkened by oils, by certain metal filings. The test is good, but not absolute. She watched, faces some clearing, some finding fresh adhesive to bond with Qian Zhao's words. Her father's brow furrowed. Her elder brother's jaw tightened. This was, she knew, a battle for proof that could be held up to the light and examined. She needed more than her voice. She needed to force discovery. Then, like a spider adding silk to a web, Qian Zhao produced the most corrosive element. A witness who swore to have seen Mingyue slip something into a cup the evening before. Zhao Fei. Kyung. Go. Cold, the girl approached. Head bowed. Her eyes flicked to Mingyue as if weighing whether a specific lie might bring a hammer down on an entire life. She was in the tea room that night. Zhao Fei said she saw Miss Mingyue leave her cup and hurry out. When she returned, the cup was on its side. The room tightened. Even an honest slip of the foot could be portrayed as intentional if the storyteller had enough arrogance to speak so often. Mingyue closed her mouth and breathed through the strategy she had rehearsed in the dark. She would not be dragged into a duel of testimonies in an hour. She would gather the kind of proof that makes testimony unnecessary. A living scholar, a corroborated observation from a servant of standing, handwriting traced to a band of hired help. Each piece was a shard that, assembled, could cut through Qian Zhao's story. She thought of Song Lin's name, and the man in the green cloak who had carried him away. The truth so often arrives as a series of small, inconvenient things: hands that remembered a coin, a cloak's thread, a name dropped by a beggar. Her work, in the hours to come, would be to find those inconvenient things, and put them where the household could not ignore them. Before the hearing broke, Qinling pulled her aside with a look like a man who had chosen his loyalty between two burning houses, and hoped to survive whichever remained. "There is a man by the east gate," he said. "He serves at the docks, loading brocade and coal. He heard talk of a carriage and a green cloak. He will tell you, if you ask him as a favor, not as a witness bound by the household." Mingyue nodded once. The hour was narrowing. She slipped from the hall with 1,000 small doors to open and 1 moment's victory to delay. When she reached the eaves, Pei Wenjing stood waiting. He was unadorned by display. He wore a rough cloak, and his hair was loose in a way that signaled either defiance or urgency. He had the look of a man who had been called back to a house where he was not welcomed, but whose presence was a leva nonetheless. "You asked for time," he said, without ceremony. "I have come to see how it is spent." Mingyue let a corner of a smile that was not surrender touch her mouth. "That depends on whether you are a man of curiosity or a man of courage, young Master Pei." "Both," he answered. "But courage without evidence looks like folly. What proof can I offer that will make a crowd listen?" She looked at him, like someone appraising a blade. "Lend me your ear to hear what Qinling has to say tonight. Listen without the intent to be persuaded only. to observe. If you find the truth, stand, so that others will see you stand. He hesitated, then inclined his head. You ask much. You can choose the nature of your choice, she said. Stand for truth, and you will stand for honor. Stand for rumor, and you will have company, but no conscience. He smiled at that, thin and fearless. Then, tell me where to stand. They moved as the household prepared to disperse, and the city wind pressed against the shutters. Mingyue felt a pressure along her spine, the patient, stubborn pressure of a tide turning not by force, but by the slow undeciding of shorelines. The day spun forward like a wheel, and with each turn Kyanjiao's net tightened. Servants were questioned separately. The physician kept his hands busy over vessels and rumors multiplied and made sense to those who would believe them. Late that night, Mingyue slipped into the eastern alley, with Qin Lang at her side, and a single lamp to guide them through faces. The docks smelled of salt and tar and honest labor, of things that did not wear masks. The man in the green cloak was not there, but a boy with a face freckled from coal dust and a conscience the size of a grain of rice, remembered a carriage and a bundle of torn parchment. He gave the name of the road where the carriage had passed, and a small description of the driver's hands. Bits accumulated like flyaways gathered for weaving a rope. They were not yet a noose. They were evidence. When she returned to the household, the night was full of omen doors bolted with the same care taken to hide an heirloom. Mingyue placed a piece of paper, with an address inside the palm of Pei Wenjing's hand, as he stood to leave. A small token that was a request, and a warning in one. Be present when needed. He held it without reading, as if the weight it carried was already understood. Inside her room, she uncorked a small bottle of oil, and wiped the blackened silver with a clean cloth. The stain on the metal did not erase itself. The truth did not vanish, simply because someone wanted it to. She pressed the cloth to her lips, and smelled mandrake under the oil, like a secret that would not stay buried. Two things had to be true for her plan to work. Song Lin had to be found alive, or the possibility of his survival established strongly enough to force the household into searching sincerely. And Pei Wenjing had to be persuaded to stand where others could see his stance. As a woman who had once been pulled under by the current of other people's choices, she understood the violence of being decided for. She would not allow the household to make an end without a proper argument. Outside her window, the moon was a thin coin. A dog barked. Somewhere a gate creaked shut. The night had not yet yielded its secrets. In the days that followed, the household's court convened again and again, each meeting a small ceremony of fear. Kyanjiao's accusations gathered an audience like tumbleweed catching on a branch. Mingyue answered with the steady economy of someone who had spent one life learning how to survive, and another learning how to prevent being surprised. Qiangao escalated little by little. First, she presented the physician's analysis, then a servant who declared under oath that a parcel had been seen slipping from a pocket. Each step was a stair. Each stair promised a summit where Mingyue would stand, shamed and unclaimed. Mingyue worked, instead, through people. She brought bread to an old woman who knew where men slept under bridges, and with that bread the woman surprised that someone would offer kindness without request recounted the passage of a tired coach. She visited the tea house, where scholars drank, and let a folded scrap of paper, its edges burned as if torn from a candlelit page, be found by a poet's hand. She left a bowl at the foot of a beggar who, in return, offered the memory of a cloak moved in the night. Each small kindness was not charity, but strategy. In the depths of the household's ordinary day, Song Lin's name became a candlelit rumor one could not quite extinguish. Someone recalled a poet's voice on a freezing road. A shepherd boy remembered a man carrying a bundle that might be the same scholar. The truth gathered like a flood behind a dam, slow and relentless. One morning, the household woke to a new rumor. Breathless, tender, impossible. A trader's wife, in transit to the capital, had seen a scholar on the road, with a green cloak. He had been sitting by a roadside inn, staring at his hands as if counting the hours. When someone had asked him his name, he had answered with a poem that spoke of water and memory. The rumor found its way to Mingyue, like a basket of eggs, fragile and valuable. It could break but it could be secured. If Song Lin were indeed alive, and could be persuaded to come, then Qian Zhao's story would need repair, beyond what gossip could patch. She moved then, with the kind of speed that belonged to a woman who had learned how quickly the world could turn, and how slowly it could be persuaded to right itself. The next family hearing would be the prelude to the flower banquet, where aristocrats would gather and where reputation went on public display. It was the stage that could destroy or restore a woman's place. Kyung-ga, sensing the change, sharpened her own efforts. She accused more loudly, sued for a formal inquiry, and requested that the matter be brought before the matriarch who oversaw family marriages and honors. The family court could only do so much. A matriarch's interest could make accusation into law. Mingyue responded not with clap of anger, but with a woven plan. Keep the household restrained, find the living scholar, gather witnesses who could stand up in a crowd, and ensure that Pei Wenjing would be there to place his weight where it mattered. The wheels of the household creaked and turned. People took sides, not always openly. There were brothers who lay awake at night, thinking of their sister the way one thinks of a fine china bowl that might break with a careless slip. Some wanted to protect family name. Some wanted the benefit that came from another's fall. Mingyue felt all of these currents like weather, and adjusted her course by them. One afternoon, while the sun warmed the courtyard stones, a servant rushed in with breath that was nearly a sob. "A man at the east gate has news," he said, words already falling over each other. "A scholar matching Song Lin's description is in the city. He was taken by a kind family to a small house by the river. He might still be living." The house exhaled. It was a beginning. Mingyue's heart speeded, a measured kind of alarm. She gathered herself and, with Qinling at her elbow, went to the small house by the river. It was the kind of place a woman might find if she were searching for a life that had been interrupted. Humble, with a courtyard where vegetables grew, and a table that bore the marks of many hands. Inside, an old woman with a stooped back, and a gaze like a bell kettle served tea, and asked for nothing in return. Song Lin sat in a corner, his hands folded around a cup, his throat moving as if tasting words. When their eyes met, something like recognition flickered across his face. Not the flash of a man who remembered a stranger, but the softer returning of someone who had been found by fate, rather than by accusation. He was thinner than the household's memory of him had allowed, and his clothes were the kind of patched things that poets wore when they had no money for pride. "Mingyue," he said, voice like a poem's last line. The name landed on his tongue with a mixture of question and gratitude, as if he had been given the wrong map, and then found out it led straight to her. She knelt before him not in submission, but in the tenderness one accords a person returned from the brink. "Song Lin," she said, "you are alive." He frowned, attempting to place her face. "You are the one who left me in a dream once," he said slowly, as if naming the pieces of a puzzle. "You cried, did you not? Or did I dream it?" Mingyue's fingers tightened around the rim of the cup. "I did not leave you this time," she said. "Tell me what happened." Song Lin told what he could. He had been knocked down the road by a scuffle meant for someone else, pushed into the mud and left. A stranger with a green cloak had picked him up and placed him in a carriage. The stranger had taken him to the house by the river, because he could not watch a scholar die in the road. The stranger had left without giving his name. When she heard this, Mingyue felt a cold shift like the lowering of a threshold. Someone, unknown, had made a choice to save. That someone might be a key or merely a mercy, she would need to know. Back at the Chancellor's household, The next family court was set to be the last, before the flower banquet. It would be the time when accusations could be defined or discarded. Qianzhao prepared her speech. Mingyue prepared hers. By then, rumor had become a small tide lifting both boats and threats. As she walked to the hall, Mingyue felt the weight of her memory, like armor. She had returned to keep herself alive and, perhaps, to save others from the same mistake, allowing the world to decide for you. She entered the family court with Song Lin at her side, a living, breathing contradiction to the idea that rumor could make death. Pei Wenjing arrived, with Qinlang's hesitant confirmation, and the two stood together in the doorway like a weather front. Qianzhao's face lost the brittle calm for the first time. The dignity she had worn as a mask was becoming brittle, and everyone could see the shadow of her calculation. This was the moment where things could be forced open or forced shut. The household watched, waiting for proof. The matriarch's emissary made note, and a hush fell like an invitation. Mingyue began to speak, not of accusation, but of the art of observation. She spoke of the way silver blackens, of the mandrake scent, and the way it could be used, as both cure and trick. She spoke of a carriage in a green cloak, without naming the man who had carried a scholar away, leaving space for discovery rather than forcing the court's hand. When Song Lin took his place to speak, his voice trembled as a man who has been given a second draft of fate. "I am here," he said plainly. "I have been brought to the river." "I am here," he said plainly. "I have been brought to the river house, and an old woman took me in. I remember being shoved from the road. There was a carriage, a green cloak, and someone who would not let me die there." The hall went very still in a way that made breath visible. Even the emissary from the matriarch folded his hands and leaned forward. Mingyue felt the attention as a tangible thing that could be guided or shattered. Song Lin's voice did not tremble from fear so much as from the awed gratitude of a man who had been given back a page of his life. "You will tell us what you remember," the Prime Minister said, voice a ledger of beauty. Song Lin the poet closed his eyes, as if the words needed to be measured before release. "I remember being struck first by a figure who smelled of river reeds and ink," he said. "I remember a carriage, and a man who wrapped a cloak around me. I remember a woman's laugh from a window, before lights were put out. I recall a hairpin falling peony, carved in a way not many know how to carve, thin and sharp as a secret." A soft stir moved through the room. Qianzhao's composure tightened. A faint shadow crossed her cheek. Hairpins could be as revealing as seals. Mingyue watched faces for the smallest sign of shifting allegiance. A brother's hand tightening on a knee. A servant's eyes darting to the doorway. Proof, piled carefully, could topple a story as surely as any sword. She had built her case not out of theatrics, but from patient, practical things. The carriage story Qinlang had given, the fragments of parchment found near the tea room, the scrap of charcoal writing left in a place a scholar might find it, the old woman who had sheltered Song Lin. Each was a small nail. Together they could pin a lie to the board. "Who saw the hairpin?" the matriarch's emissary asked, measured and unyielding. Song Lin blinked, as if catching the edge of a memory. "I do not know whose hand it belonged to," he admitted, "but as my head cleared, I remembered the carriage's lantern swung low and a glint like a woman's hairpin fell, and was stepped on. I felt the metal against my palm, when I woke, and where might such a hairpin be seen?" One of Mingyue's younger brothers muttered. The question carried curiosity more than accusation. "A peony carved like that is not common in the market," Song Lin said. "I have seen one such, at a festival worn by a girl who sat by a high window, pale as milk and sharp as jade. Her laugh was like the peel of unripe fruit." Qianzhao laughed, then, thin and practiced. "How poetic," she said, dismissing the slice of memory, as if the world could be convinced by disdain. "Stories do not make men alive again. This is theater. The silver tells truth. The physician has analyzed it." The physician, who had been forced into the center of the story before, said little. His hands trembled barely when he lifted another cup for inspection. He had been placed in a position where his silence might be treated as agreement, or his words as treachery. Mingyue had seen the same fear in him that she had seen in her father's jaw. Mingyue stood. She walked forward, not to confront, but to arrange the next piece of fact upon the table. If Songling can swear to a carriage and a hairpin, she said softly, then we must ask whether someone could have made the cup black, by application, rather than by poison in the tea. Qiang Zhao had expected a defenseless speech grief or plea, but Mingyue offered instead a method and a slight challenge. The household's attention shifted, because method allowed men to place their trust in a thing more dependable than rumor. At the least, Mingyue continued, we should consider the parcel that was seen. If someone intended to trick this household, someone might have prepared an agent to create that blackening. Let the parcel be produced and examined. If the household wishes to know if my fainting was caused by poison, then we will test the tea again, under eyes that are not paid to say what they are told to say. A murmur. Kyanja's smile tightened to the edge of a knife. The Prime Minister inclined his head. Let the parcel be produced, he said. If it exists, let us see it. A servant, one of the low-ranked who had first pointed out the parcel's movement, stood, cheeks dark with shame and a fear that made his voice small. I have it, he said. I kept it, fearing I would be punished if I spoke. Chen Lang stepped forward, his presence smoothing the frightened man's trembling. The guard's face was set. Bring it, he said without theatrics. That would invite notice. If there is truth, there will be no fear in showing it. When the parcel was opened, the hall smelled faintly of oil and iron. Inside lay a small glass vial capped with wax, its interior showing a dark, viscous substance that shone like river tar. Alongside it, a scrap of torn paper bore hurried ink strokes and a name one of the household scribes could not say for certain, but the serpentine flourish at the end of the signature matched the chirography used by those who wrote in sealed letters for Kyan Shao's circle. They had seen that penmanship on invitations, on notes that passed under doors. Kyan Zhao's face paled at that sight, even as she tried to arrange her features into concern. Any servant could have put that there, she said. Forgery is a common tool for the desperate. You signed such invitations once yourself, the Prime Minister's elder half-brother said coldly, lifting his chin. He was a man who kept records in his head and did not like when facts were rearranged to suit emotion. Our household has practices. We know the hand that writes to our inner kitchens. A member of the household who had long kept inventory in old steward whose eyes rarely registered surprise stepped forward. He took the scrap and looked at the flow of the letters as a man might read a blade's pattern. This is the flourish used by Qianzhao steward, he said. Not fake. Not common. The wax matches a seal used in her suite. Qianzhao swallowed. A sound like someone taking in air for a held scream. The hall's gaze drew like a net around her. Mingyue did not leap on the chest of her sister's guilt. She arranged the evidence with the neat hand she had learned from healing wounds. If oil like this is applied to silver, she said, it will blacken when it contacts certain waters, and react in ways mistaken for alkaloid. Mandrake will also react with silver, but the color and the smell differ. If someone intended to create a display of poisoning, such an oil could be used. At a small signal, Pei Wenjing, who had been standing more to the back, watching the family's motions, stepped forward and lifted the vial to the light. The young master's motion was simple and carried an unspoken challenge. A man of status testing a thing publicly. You would have us believe, Qianzhao said, voice rising with brittle indignation, that my household would stoop to such forgery. Show us the test, the matriarch's emissary said, voice quiet, commanding. The phrase hung in the hall like a gavel. Song Lin's testimony had begun the thread. The parcel had loosened a knot. No action required demonstration proof. That would make it difficult to keep weaving a lie. Pei Wenjing poured a small drop of water into the empty cup that had once held Mingyu's tea. He took the saucer, with the blackened silver that the physician had preserved, and wiped it clean with a piece of linen that smelled faintly of mandrag. Mingyue had ensured such a cloth was available and applied a drop of the dark oil from the vial. The silver darkened immediately along the spot where the oil touched. The blackness spread ink across the metal. A ripple moved through the hull. "See," Pei Wenjing said with simple calm. "This blot appears from the oil alone. No tea, no poison, only application." The physician's face collapsed into a study of lines. His earlier pronouncement now sat beside a demonstration that undermined it. Men paid more attention to what they could watch than to what they were told. The demonstration spoke with the weight of sight. Qianzhao reached then for a defense. "You cannot test like this," she cried. "Anyone can make oil darkened silver. This proves nothing." "You said silver proves poison," Mingyue returned, voice almost pleasant in how even it was. "Your argument has been that the silver blackened by itself, that my fainting correlated with poison taking effect. But we have a man who claims to have been carried away from a road, and left for dead. We have a parcel with a prepared oil. We have a scrap signed in a flourish that belongs to your steward. If an accusation demands proof, we have provided proof that lifts doubt rather than creates it." Eyes moved now not to Song Lin but to the person they had come to watch. She had, in the weeks before the banquet, fashioned the narrative of Mingyue's guilt, with small, precise cuts. Each cut now bled when pressed. Mingyue asked the old steward to step forward and confirm the signature. He did so with the careful dignity of a man who had written inventories for decades. He traced the loop at the end of the signature, with a finger that bore ink stains of a generation. "It is her steward's hand," he said. "Wax and flourish shame seal impressions?" In inventories kept in Qianzhao's chest. Pei Wenjing did not shout. He laid the vial on the table, then reached into his cloak and produced, quietly, the scrap of paper Mingyue had given him that morning, a note bearing the name of the river house where Songlin had recovered, left at the very inn where a poet's eyes might linger. He placed it beside the scrap from the parcel and allowed them to sit, two pieces of paper like small islands of proof. "You asked me earlier what proof would make me stand," he said quietly to where Mingyue could hear. "A vow that did not need to be shouted. This is proof enough that they were prepared to manufacture a scene. I will not stand for a lie dressed as care." The matriarch's emissary folded his hands and sighed. He had the power to widen the inquiry. The Empress's attention could be called upon if the household wished it. "This will be reported," he said, "but in the meantime, we must decide whether there was collusion." Qianzhao's denial frayed. Her cheeks burned. "I am innocent," she hissed. "You would all turn against me for ambition. Who benefits if Mingyue is removed?" Mingyue asked, voice like the stroke of a blade. "Who gains a place at a table if her chair is empty?" There was no immediate answer. Someone always benefited from another's absence, but motives alone were not conviction. Conviction required testimony. At that moment, Song Lin cleared his throat. "I remember the muffled voice of a woman in a window," he said. "I remember, faintly, the clink of a small vial and a man's quick step, as if he hurried to hide something. The woman's laugh was not the laughter of a passerby. It was a laugh that knew the weight of men, SMEs fortunates. Those words were not a finger pointing, but they were a current drawing faces toward Qian. Mingyue had expected this sort of testimony. She had built her strategy around it. The parcel and the handwriting made a pattern. Song Lin's memory painted its background. The hall's atmosphere sharpened into accusation, and Qianzhao's support began to creak. The Prime Minister, who had leaned heavily on appearance before, found that his duty now asked him to act on tangible things. He bade the steward fetch Zhao Fei. The girl who had first said Mingyue left the cup. Zhao Fei came forward with the sickly stiffness of someone who had been coached. Her eyes avoided Mingyue's. I saw it, she said. I saw Miss Mingyue leave and return. When she returned, the cup was on its side. Mingyue's face remained calm. She could have struck with words that would shatter Zhao Fei until she cried, but such theatrics were unnecessary. She instead sent Qin Lang forward with a look. Qin Lang bent his head and spoke with the plainness of a guard who had been fed a secret too long. Zhao Fei has told the truth as she has been told to tell it, he said. I spoke to her the night the parcel was hidden. She was paid to look where she was told, and to say what she was told. She feared for her place. Gasps scattered like startled birds. Zhao Fei's face went white. A woman at Qian Zhao's side reached for her hand, and then withdrew. The motion of someone who calculated where cruelty might fall. You cannot simply allege bribery, Qian Zhao said, voice now a thin pleading. Then asked the girl why she feared to speak otherwise. The matriarch's emissary said. Ask who paid her. We have a steward's flourish on a scrap and a vial to match. Let us ask plainly. Qin Lang did so, under the gentle but unyielding pressure of a guard who had seen men tremble before justice. Zhao Fei's sound broke like a shell. She confessed first in tremors, then with the solid words of a child relieved from pretense. I feared Qiang Jia would punish me, she said. She promised a favor. She gave me the note and told me what to say. That I would correct Qian Zhao's composure. She tried to recover steam, to argue that the servant could be coerced, that the steward's flourish was common knowledge among those who wrote and sealed the household's letters, that a seamstress might have copied handwriting. Each argument slid from the room like oil on water slick, but not binding. When the matriarch's emissary lifted his hand to call for order, the petition had the exactness of someone who knows the weight of law. This household has rules, he said. If there is evidence of deliberate deception intended to remove a household member through slander and staged cause, then this is within the matriarch's concern. I recommend we bring the matter before the matriarch's younger cousin, now present at the flower banquet. Let the banquet be the place where it is resolved with witnesses and authority. There was a collective intake of breath at that suggestion. The flower banquet would be dangerous, as much a theater of power as any court. But it was precisely that danger which Mingyue had sought. A public setting where a woman's fate could not be decided by a whispered cabal in the hallway. It would be public, and thus corrective. Qian Zhao's face lost the last of its color into a brittle white. You would humiliate me publicly? She said. Rhetoric now a defense of vanity? We would see the truth, Mingyue answered. If you are innocent, you will be cleared in front of all. If you are not, then justice must be served publicly, so the household may be mended. The Prime Minister had no appetite for scandal, but he had an appetite for order. Let it be, as she says, he agreed, voice hoarse with the cost of decision. We will present the matter at the banquet. The matriarch will attend. I will send word to the Empress's court that the household seeks an airing. Words scattered like seeds? The flower banquet, which had been arranged for trade and delicate politics, became the scene of a household's future. Mingyue felt, in her chest, the slow drop of a heart, finally allowed to beat on its own terms. The next days were a choreography of quiet work. She and Qin Lang found the maid who had hidden the parcel. Pei Wenjing walked the inn's lane where Song Lin had rested, and learned more of the carriage man who had saved him. Servants who had been bribed or threatened were coaxed into truth by careful kindnesses and the steady presence of the young master. A final piece came unexpectedly from a place Mingyue had not expected a sword to be sheathed. Qian Zhao herself, in a moment of private hubris, had left a pin in a place a servant collected laundry. The laundrywoman, when questioned with gentleness, and with the right small bribe of a meal, and promised work, handed the pin over. It was neither elaborate nor glorious a hairpin like 1,000 others, but its carving, upon closer inspection by Songlin and the old steward, matched the description he had given, a peony cut with a small nick on the edge. as if made by a hurried hand. It was a small thing, but small things could be loud when assembled. The day of the flower banquet arrived with bright weather, and with the city, dressed in silk, carriages arrived like lines of small flags at the gates. The household had been speaking of the event in whispers for days. How the matriarch would sit at the center, how noble women would place themselves like chess pieces, how the empress's emissary might attend if the matter required weight. Mingyue dressed in a robe that made no attempt at triumph. Her hair was done with care and without ornament. Her iron pin lay hidden where no one might wish to steal it as a token. She felt a steadiness she had not known in her previous life. The strange, hard-born courage of someone who had looked down an abyss and chosen a path around it. Pei Wenjing stood by her side when they entered the dais. Not touching, but present. A line of support she could lean on when the strain asked more than she could give alone. His presence was visit. Rumors, he had said that morning, were seeds that grew best in the soil of silence. He would be the voice to call them what they were. The banquet began with the air of social performance. Flowers arranged, like soft promises, incense, thin and soothing, and the city's important women arranged, like a constellation. Wine flowed, in measured portion. Conversation, a lace of alliances. Mingyue knew every eye in that room would count one for either her or for her sister. Qianzhao entered last, in the costume of a woman who had prepared to receive triumph. Her steps were deliberate, but the smile was not quite steady. She had built much on the assumption that no one would look too hard at patched evidence. The matriarch sat, a woman with soft silver hair and a gaze that weighed towers rather than baubles. Beside her, the emissary nodded as if the evening were a scale ready to measure right and wrong. Guests spoke in measured tones. Some watched with primal interest, as if hungry for another's downfall. Mingyue waited for the matriarch to signal. When she did, Mingyue rose. "Your Grace," Mingyue said, voice calm enough to float over the room like a cool breeze. "I ask for a demonstration, and for witnesses. If there are those who would speak in my favor, let them stand now. If there are those who would speak to my guilt, let them do so before all." The matriarch inclined her head. "We will see the truth in measured light," she said. "Have the physician and the steward bring the article and the parcel." Pei Wenjing took the steward's hand, and spoke gently to him. The steward, steadied by the young master's quiet concern, came forward with the blackened silver and the vial. The old steward also presented the laundry pin and the scrap of handwriting from the parcel. The room watched like a held breath. Songlin was called to the dais. He came, face pale but resolute, and told his memory, again simple, without flourish, and in the telling included the detail the hairpin had given him when, recovering, he had touched metal in the palm of his hand. The matriarch's emissary listened, and then asked a practical question. Would the oil in that vial cause the blackening we have seen? Could someone simulate such an effect, to make it appear that poison was present? Mingyue answered with the calm of a scientist. Yes. The oil, when combined with certain residues found on cups and on silver, will darken the metal and be mistaken by an untrained hand for alkaloid reaction. It is a crude trick, but it works when those who examine it want a simple conclusion. At that, Pei Wenjing lifted the vial, and poured a measured drop into a fresh bowl of water. Before the gathered women and men, the steward took the blackened silver, wiped it clean, and then the oil was applied. The silver darkened along the wet path, at Pei Wenjing's slow, deliberate hand. Murmurs rose as the demonstration settled like smoke into the air. Then the matriarch's emissary did something unexpected. He ordered that Qianzhao's chambers be opened, and searched for items matching the vial's residue. If this was prepared in private, he intoned, then the instruments used must be found in her suite. A maker of false accidents seldom hides all traces. Qianzhao's face folded into panic. Her protest was sharp. She objected with the righteous indignation of someone aghast that she would be spied upon. But the matriarch's authority carried a weight few dared resist, a search was ordered, and servants was sent to fetch the house keys, and the elder steward, who had known the chambers, like a map. The search was quick and mercilessly tidy. In a small chest between embroidered garments, a servant found a small wax-sealed vessel, identical to the one seen in the parcel. In a drawer beneath, a scrap of fabric with the same scent of reeds. The guest at the inn had described the underguard's mark. Used in Qianzhao's sleeve lay folded. The hairpin matching the Nick Song Lin had described sat nestled in a velvet, as if discarded by accident but kept by someone who thought they were clever. When the items were produced before the banquet's guests, the room shifted. There was no dramatic confession at once, instead a quiet, accumulating logic closed around Qianzhao's story. The steward's hand trembled as he laid the evidence on the dais. Qianzhao rose, like a flame, licked by a breeze. Her eyes went wildly from face to face, measuring where support might be found. Her lover's supporters faintly present in the crowd did not move. The matriarch's emissary's face had turned to stone. "Who placed those items?" the matriarch asked. Her voice was not loud but it cut. "Do you deny them, Miss Qianzhao?" Qianzhao's denial came out as a whisper that could not fill the hall. "I know this is a conspiracy," she stammered. "They plant things to make me seem false. It is my sister who..." Qinlang stepped forward then. The guard's boots a sound of order. He spoke plainly and without drama. "I saw a maid from Qianzhao's service slip from the inner kitchen with a small parcel," he said. "I followed. I saw her hand something to a servant, who later admitted she had been paid." At Qinlang's words, a maid who had been hovering near the back began to cry. Her weeping was small and real. "I was paid," she said, shame in every line of voice. "I was cruel. I was given bread and promised security to lie. I will not lie again." The matriarch's emissary closed his eyes for a brief second, and then opened them with a decision. "This is a matter of household law," he said. "We will not speculate. We will lay out the facts." A parcel prepared with a liquid to blackened silver, handwriting traced to Qianzhao's steward, a hairpin found, matching the description given by Song Lin, coerced testimony from a servant. "We will present this to the matriarch for a ruling on intent." Qianzhao's face collapsed now into the rawness of a woman who had miscounted how much of the world would back her. She had expected whispering lanes, not the harsh daylight of a banquet floor. She had expected rumor to be enough. Instead, the household had built a small cathedral of proof. "This is an act of attempted slander, and of attempt to cause the household to execute a woman without cause," the matriarch's emissary declared. "Under the laws recognized by this family and by the matriarch's council, such acts are punishable by stripping of household privileges and, when necessary, exile. The matriarch will decide." Qianzhao fell to her knees then. Emotion both theatrical and desperate, she wept and begged for mercy, for reconsideration, thrusting herself into the center as if by supplication she could reclaim what she had plotted to seize. But supplication, when its hand had been used to bind another, has little audience, beyond pity, and even pity can be empty when the weight of evidence is such. The matriarch considered in the hush. Then the matriarch made a ruling, not with revenge, but with measured severity. Qianzhao would be stripped of her claim to any household advantage, assigned to live outside the chancellor's household, under the oversight of a lesser relative for a period of years, forbidden to attend court functions, and to be presented at festivals. Her steward would be dismissed. Any gift she had received would be returned. If she had committed acts beyond the staging of a cup, if there was evidence of more, then the Empress's court would be petitioned for further justice. When the decree was read, there was a ripple of satisfaction and, for many, relief. The Prime Minister's face was ashen. He had not wanted his family cast into scandal, but he had not wanted to be shown as complicit in an injustice either. The household's balance, for now, shifted toward rightness, however imperfect. Kyanja's eyes rolled with the knowledge that her ambitions had burned into ruin. She was led away under the supervision of guards, her jewelry stripped in private and her carriage sent to the outer gate. The act of being led away was less a punishment than a removal of the instrument she had long used to climb. Proximity to the family. Mingyue felt no triumph. Like a sword stroke, her chest felt hollow with the fatigue of what justice required. Cunning, and the willingness to be exposed to slander, long enough to gather proof. She had not sought to watch her sister disgraced, she had sought to live. The distinction mattered. Pei Wenjin came to her side after the matriarch's emissary nodded to the attendants. "You did this with a surgeon's care," he said quietly. "Not loud enough for the crowd but close enough for her. You arranged for truth instead of theater. That takes courage." Mingyue let herself permit a small smile. The kind that's soft rather than sharpened. "I returned to a life I had once lost," she said. "I would not have it taken again, but I do not wish for ruin." He touched a hand brief. Respectful. "Then we will do what is needed, not what is vengeful. I will stand with you, in public, as you wish." The matriarch's emissary, seeing the exchange, offered a final public admonition. "Households cannot be allowed to collapse into petty plotting," he said. "Let this be a lesson. Those who protect truth will be protected. Those who betray household trust will answer for it." In the following days, the household adjusted. The Prime Minister's face showed the strain of arranging future of calming vassals, and of repairing the household's reputation. In the eyes of other officials, brothers offered the kind of deferred apologies that families craft with the right mix of avoidance and tribute. Some who had backed Kyanja quietly kissed the generational soil and bent their heads. Others moved toward Mingyue with awkwardness that smelled of conscience. Mingyue, for her part, restored the things that could be repaired. She asked not for public revenge, but for measured justice. Her request to the matriarch was simple: that Kyanja be sent away, but provided for. B. That any children or dependents be cared for. That no further blood be shed for the sake of grief or petty ambition. She would have liked to have demanded harsher punishment, but she chose mercy with conditions: protective exile and public disgrace, rather than death. Mercy, she had learned in a past life, does not mean forgetting. It means controlling the terms of reconciliation so that it does not feed new harm. Pei Wenjing's small hand held hers. In the quiet hours, when the household's noise had ebbed, the young master of the Duke's house was a man of quiet decisions. His presence was not a rescue in the melodramatic sense, but the steadying of a bridge leaning against a storm. He did not make grand vows then. Only a posture. He would stand where it mattered. "You were right to call for the banquet," he said once, as they walked the courtyard at dusk. Lanterns hovered like warm moons. Truth belongs in the open. "And you were right to stand," Mingyue answered. "You did not stand because I asked you to. You stood because something here made you choose." He looked at her with a mix of humor and depth that suggested stronger things might grow where trust had been planted. "Perhaps," he said, "perhaps this house will have a stranger who will speak for truth when others fall silent." Mingyue laughed softly, a sound like water over small stones. "Perhaps," she agreed, though she did not yet imagine what might unfold. In the weeks after, Songlin visited quietly, his gratitude small, and his manners those of a poet who had been given a life to translate into verse. He came with small gifts: a folded page with a new poem, a pressed sprig of river herb. He never spoke of dramatic friendship or of impossible futures. He simply recounted the odd, quietly tender ways the world sometimes returned favors. "You made me feel seen," he told her once, in a voice that hinted at the musicians of taverns more than the gold of courts. "And for that, I owe you a pen and a place to sit when I write." Mingyue found that her triumph had a different flavor than she had imagined in the night. when she had rehearsed revenge. There was relief sharp and brightened. Then a slower thing, the exhaustion of having to fight for a life one might have expected to own by birthright. She spent many evenings in quiet contemplation, writing lists of how to mend small things. The steward who had been dismissed would be given a small pension. The maid who had lied would be forgiven but kept away from crucial roles. The household's physicians would be admonished and required to swear new impartiality in their duties. Qianzhao's removal was public, but not annihilating. She was sent to a relative's house beyond the city's walls, where she would be kept in a form of hush. No court functions, no household privileges. The matriarch's order allowed for food and shelter, but it would grant Qianzhao no place in the family's future ascendancies. The public nature of the punishment would be the lesson one needed. Private repentance would be possible, if she desired it. When Qianzhao was taken away, she passed Mingyue briefly in the courtyard. Their eyes met, in a look that contained 1,000 things. Accusation, regret, hunger for what might have been. Qianzhao opened her mouth, but closed it. Words would have been aimless arrows. The gardeners watched like men who had learned to read storms. Mingyue did not gloat. She had not become a woman who rejoiced in another's ruin. She had become a woman who guarded her life fiercely and shaped justice to prevent repeated harm. The matriarch's decree had been firm and public, an important correction in a world that often dressed injustice as propriety. The household's life regned itself slowly after the scandal like a tapestry mended by careful hands. There were awkward dinners, long silences, and an ongoing soft rumor that someday the Empress's court might call for further inquiry into the matter. That possibility lingered like a storm on the horizon. Mingyue faced it with the cautious watchfulness of someone who had learned to expect waves. Pei Wenjing's visits continued not because she needed protection, but because two people, who had stood in the same storm, sometimes chose to see one another again. He did not speak of marriage or ownership. He brought instead small, steady things. A bowl of broth, when she worked late, an extra blanket laid across a chair, a hand that steadied her when news arrived that threatened to set the household afloat again. Once, in a quiet, after-breakfast hour, Pei Wenjing asked about her choice to show mercy rather than to press for harsher punishment. "You could have asked for ruin," he said frankly. "You did not." "Why?" Mingyue watched the steam rise from her cup for a moment. "Because ruin is an answer that often breeds only more ruin," she said. "I do not wish to build my life on ashes. I want to build it on something that can hold weight. Justice can be fierce without being vengeful." He nodded, as if that made sense to him, in the bone. "It is a brave thing to choose the harder restraint of mercy," he said. "The world tells us to strike. Standing down is sometimes harder." She smiled then with the tired softness of someone who had earned small peace. "I have had both the taste of ruin and the scar of survival. I choose what leaves me whole." Songlin's presence at the household became a quiet solace. He read from folded pages in the garden sometimes, and his lines about water and memory, and the odd kindness of strangers fit the courtyard like new tiles. He never claimed intimacy more tender than friendship. His gratitude took the form of steady fellowship, not drama. Months passed. The household's reputation was patched and then mended. Invitations returned in polite forms, and people who had watched for the spectacle now watched for the way the household carried itself. Qianzhou's name, once hot with gossip, faded into a cold footnote in letters, and in the low hum of market talk. Yet Mingyue understood that dangers never fully recede. They adapt. The matriarch's punishment had not ended ambition only, redirected it. She spent time building new networks of loyalty, educating servants in proper practices, and ensuring that people had less cause to be bribed and more cause to be honest. She established small reforms in how the household's internal disputes were handled. More witnesses in hearings, stricter inventory logs, and a practice of public inspection for any accusations that might end lives or reputations. To the household's younger women and men, Mingyue became an example of a woman who navigated the spikes of rumor and the tightness of law with the two instruments at her disposal: intelligence and compassion. That reputation spread quietly, a seed of calm. On a cool night, some weeks after the banquet, Mingyue stood on the garden wall and watched the city's lanterns glow like breathing constellations. Pei Wenjing came and stood beside her without announcement. They listened to the rivers hush together. Two people who had been present in a night that had changed them. "You gave me a life's second chance," she said at last. Voice soft enough for only him. "Not just to eke out time, but to choose how to live it." He turned to her, expression unshowy and real. "You gave many people a second chance tonight," he answered. "You asked for restraint, not for weakness, but because you knew how to wield it." Their hands found each other, then not the dramatic clasp of lovers but the firm meeting of allies. No vow was necessary in that moment. They had already made small promises, the kind that live in the quiet acts of presence. Mingyue's eyes traveled across the courtyard, and then to the city beyond. There would be new seasons, there would be new challengers. She had not returned to this life to become a passive ornament. She had returned to be seen, to be heard, to place herself where her life could not be taken again by rumor, or by the small cruelties of those who would profit from another's fall. "Will you stay?" she asked Pei Wenjing. More a question about promise than about place. He answered, not with words of ownership but with a statement of intent. "I will stand where I am needed," he said. "If that is by your side, to speak when silence would allow lies, I will stand. If that is elsewhere, I will do what is right. But I am not here by fortune. I have made a choice." Mingyue felt, in that small exchange, the soft scaffolding of something that might become deeper in time. She did not rush it. She had learned that speed in the wrong place could cost a life. As the night deepened and the lanterns flickered low, she remembered the first moment her teacup had trembled and fallen, the symbol of a life poised between ruin and resistance. She had come back to unmake a past that had been cruel, and to make something steadier. The sister's deception had backfired in the best possible way. Not because Qianjia was humiliated for sport, but because truth assembled patiently, and presented with courage had unbound a tangled knot. There would be repairs to make, and tests to pass. There would be, perhaps, more people who would try to use rumor as a weapon. Mingyue knew this, but she also knew that a house that practiced truth in public made it harder for lies to craft a final verdict. She inhaled the night air, cool and honest, and allowed herself a small, guarded hope. For now, the household held together. For now, the sisters' plot had been unraveled before a public that could see the weave and offer a measured correction. She had been vindicated. She had been spared the annihilation she had once suffered. And in the quiet after the storm, she felt the slow, sure building of a life that might, with care, be worth defending again. If you want to follow what comes next, if you want to see whether the matriarch's settlement will hold, or how Mingyue and the young master will shape a future built on careful merziza prescribe, and watch the next chapter. The lanterns dimmed. The city slept. Mingyue, standing on the wall with a friend and an ally by her side, turned from the glow and looked toward the house. She would now help steady. Justice had been done, in measured balance. Revenge had not been the lodestar. She would keep watch, she would cultivate truth, and she would not let memory be the reason she lost herself again. She would use it as the reason she built, patiently and unafraid, the life she had been given.